One of the things that really struck me very early on in the residency was that South Australia is a small economy. You know, even within the framework of Australia, it's a small economy. It has about 1.8 million inhabitants, of which most are in Adelaide. And as a small economy, that raises some specific issues which are normally forgotten when one talks about issues on competition and so on. And to illustrate them, there are two specific problems that faces generally small economy. One is that the fewer heads you have, the less probability that you're going to have a good idea for a given problem. So if you have a problem that you raise with 3 people and a problem that you raise with 50 people, it's more likely you're going to have a good idea among the 50 than it is you're going to have among the 3. So therefore there is something around ensuring that solutions to problems are really well grounded in a small economy, and sometimes that require governments to have a more active and interventionist role in smaller economy than it does in a large economy. The second issue has to do with geographical location. So if I start a company somewhere, over time I develop a set of customers, and if my customers are geographically located where I am not, over time you have a tendency to migrate yourself to where these customers are. And the more rational your decision making is, the earlier this will take place. In other words, if I am a firm owned by an investor that is purely financial in their interest, it is more likely that I'm going to migrate early in my career compared to if I'm a company owned by a private individual who is embedded in the local community and hence does not want to leave it. So these are two issues that are quite unique when it comes to smaller economies and tend to be forgotten when you look at larger economies. The other area that struck me around South Australia is that it is an economy that is just on the cusp of two things. One is a challenge to its traditional manufacturing sector, and it is the economy in Australia with the second largest dependency on manufacturing as a proportion of economic activity, just after Victoria. The other one is that it is on the cusp of a boom in the resources sector. Now, both of these things can be made into opportunities, or both of these things can be made into threats. So if you take the threats first and the opportunities later, one of the threats around the resource-based economy is that if it's not well managed, you end up with two challenges at least. One is the challenge of retaining any value created, and the other one is the challenge of managing the macroeconomic scenario. In other words, the resource sector may absorb people, making it difficult to hire people in the rest of the economy. It may drive up salaries. It may drive up need for certain things, removing them from the rest of the economy. And if a lot of money is retained in the economy, it may have an implication on the exchange rate. For South Australia itself, that is not necessarily a major issue because it's part of Australia as a larger economy where this might be an issue. But the former parts around the availability of manpower and other resources can be a risk. And that of course links to the challenge in the manufacturing part of the economy. And why is the decline in manufacturing that may result from this a problem? Well, it is because sometimes it is forgotten that manufacturing has a huge implication for jobs in the rest of the economy. So in practice, if you have one job in manufacturing, it drives between 2 and 5 jobs in the rest of the economy. If you have one job in services, it drives less than one job in the rest of the economy. So for every job you lose in manufacturing, you lose many more jobs in the economy. So the scenario about manufacturing is that it's not only challenged by the resources boom, it is also challenged by the scenario that relates to the cost base of the economy. Australia has a tradition of coming historically from a provider of raw material, moving into a manufacturing that has been cost-based. Now when the underlying shifts are such that you no longer are a low-cost economy, you are a high-cost economy, that means that the companies that were active based on being located in a low-cost economy can no longer succeed operating in a traditional way. And that means they will either decline and die or have to change. Of course, the latter is much preferable. But this change is slow, And the growth of all those successful new companies that are made for this environment is also, relatively speaking, slow. So you will have a decline in manufacturing from the traditional side, which will hide what is an increase in successful new firms, but over time they will take over, so you get a little bit of a hump scenario here. And that, of course, is very, very challenging for an economy. The second domain is innovation, where firms in Australia are excellent problem solvers. In other words, I come to the firm, I have a problem, the firm is very, very good at very rapidly coming up with a solution to the problem. But that is not a scalable activity. You know, it's something you do on and off depending on the problem that happens to come into the door. So it actually is not a very good thing in spite of it solving the problem. Australian firms are also not very good at innovation. Innovation is a strategic work long-term towards having the capability and the offering that addresses a predetermined set of solutions that matter to many people. So on the whole, Australian firms are good problem solvers and bad innovators. So one of my key recommendations relates to innovation. And innovation is something that firms here need to be better in, and they need to understand what it is. In innovation, in a sense, requires a number of things. The first one is you need to have enablers that makes it possible for you to innovate. You need to have some money, you need to have some physical resources, you need to have some customer relationships, you need to have some possibly brand or processes, and you need to have some competence. Without these things, you can't really innovate. Then when you do start your innovation, you have to ensure that you become very good at creating value through innovation. And you do that in many domains. You do that, as you will see in other areas of this interview. You will do it through science and technology, you will do it through design, you will do it through art, and you will do it through things that are called hermeneutics, which all integrated together with efficiency improving innovations create more value. And then finally, you need to appropriate these values. In other words, if you create a value, you have to ensure that the next guy in your value chain does not take all that value, but that you appropriate some of it for yourself. And you do that by maximizing the relevance of what you produce from your customer's point of view and having a smart business model that enables you to appropriate those values created. And firms here needs to be much, much better in this domain. And part of that responsibility, ultimately, almost all of it, rests on the firm. But some of it also rests on things like universities in order to enable the firm to have access to the knowledge and be provided the capability in terms of competence to do these things. So this, of course, then raises the issue of universities. And I have really found it quite interesting to spend some time with universities, not only here in South Australia, but throughout Australia. And there is a fundamental attitude difference among the universities here and the ones I'm more used to. You have excellent science in whatever domain you pick in Australia, and you actually rate very, very highly on science in most research you can find where you compare countries. You also are very good at the inputs. You invest a lot in science. You provide the research infrastructure. You have buildings. You have all those things. So your input side is very good. Where you're struggling is the output side. And all research shows that you get very little back on your investments and activities in science from an economic value creating point of view. You get excellent science, as evidenced by your recent Nobel Prize and so on. But the relationship between output in industrial value creation terms, let's call it innovation, and input on the science side is among the poorest in the OECD world. So what are the issues around that? Well, I think it's fundamentally because the mental models that are used in universities here are not conducive to engagement with industry. And engagement with industry is the foundation for economic value creation. Firstly, the priority for universities is research. And in order to do research, you need money. And there are three sources of funding for a university that is clearly visible here in Australia. One is government funding, which actually is very large. The second one is doing education as a means of making money to fund research, which is very common here. And that has some not so good implications for the way education is done, generally speaking. And the third one is firms, where a firm approaching a university here is frequently seen as a source of funding rather as an opportunity for a long-term engagement with the firm in order to develop new knowledge and apply it in the firm level. There are, of course, great examples and exceptions to these things where these things have worked very, very well. But there is an issue there. And I think there is something about ensuring that universities take a greater responsibility to engage with SMEs. And this is very difficult and very expensive. And the SMEs themselves find this very difficult and almost scary to try to engage with the university. So here we really need to put in place drivers that enables this dialogue to take place, because if it does take place, lots of good things can come out of that.